I'd like to thank you for joining us in our podcast. Today we're in the book of Second Corinthians again, chapter 11, verse number 4. And again, the Apostle Paul is dealing with false apostles or false leaders in the church at Corinth. The Apostle Paul has had a tremendous amount of problems out of these false people, these false leaders, these false apostles is what he calls them, in the church at Corinth. In fact, I believe that it was those false teachings that had actually led the church of Corinth astray, and Paul had to write a very scathing letter of 1 Corinthians to bring them back. And now these apostles, these leaders are still present, and they're still there trying to lead people away from the simplicity of the gospel. That's what we talked about yesterday. But now in verse number 4, the Apostle Paul says this: "For if one comes and preaches another Jesus, whom we have not preached." How many of you realize that there's people that will come and preach another Jesus? They will not preach the same Jesus that we believe in. They will not preach the same Jesus of the Bible. They will preach a Jesus that was a good man. Jesus was a great prophet. Jesus was this, but they will not come and say Jesus is the Son of God. He died on the cross as a perfect sacrifice for our sins. If you believe in him and trust him, then you will be saved. They don't preach that gospel, but they preach another Jesus. And just because they're talking about Jesus, you need to ask them, and you need to ask yourself this question: what Jesus are you talking about? You know, there's false prophets and false teachers that are running around, not only here in the United States, but around the world, and they're preaching a Jesus that doesn't exist. But yet they call themselves Christians. They say Jesus was a good man and all kinds of things. And the Apostle Paul is confronting this now in the city of Corinth. And he's saying they preach another Jesus whom we have not preached. In other words, you need to go back to the Jesus that we told you about. Now keep in mind, the Apostle Paul was the first person to ever step foot in Corinth and talk about Jesus. They had never heard about Jesus until Paul came. And Paul came and he preached Jesus. He preached Jesus, the Son of God. He preached Jesus, the perfect man, the man without sin, who died on the cross and took our sins. He preached that Jesus. And any other Jesus that someone preaches needs to be rejected and needs to be called out. And so the Apostle Paul says they preach another Jesus, and then he goes on and he says, "Or you receive a different spirit which you have not received." The word different is the Greek word heteros, and it means something completely different. We get our word heterosexual. In other words, there's a man and there's a woman. They are completely different. When you listen to a person and they're preaching a Jesus that's not the Jesus of the Bible, this is the problem. You can pick up a different spirit. He said, "Or you receive a different spirit which you have not received." Something completely different from God. You know what? We need to make sure that we are not just following signs and wonders. Now, I believe in signs and wonders. I believe signs and wonders, as they flow from the hand of God, are the calling card of God. But you know what? The enemy also goes out and he does supernatural things. He does spiritual things. And we need to be very careful that we're not participating with a different spirit, something that's completely different than the Spirit of God. And so the Apostle Paul talks about preaching another Jesus. Now he's talking about a different spirit. And then he goes on and he says, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, and you bear this beautifully. A different gospel. What's he talking about? Well, there were some people there in Corinth that were saying, you know what, yeah, you can be Christians, but you need to follow the law. You better not eat any pork chops. You better not do this, you better not do that, because if you do that, you're not going to be walking with Jesus. You know, there's a religious movement that says, oh yeah, you're saved by faith, but your destiny in heaven depends on how holy you live now here on earth. You know what? They're preaching a different gospel. They're preaching a different good news. How many of you know that it's not good news when someone tells you, oh yeah, you can be a Christian, but you need to do this, 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 and this, and this. Now, I'm not giving you permission to sin, because the grace of God doesn't give you permission to sin. It gives you the power to overcome sin. But we need to be very careful when we listen to people. What is the gospel? What is the good news that they are presenting? You know, there's what some people are calling the gospel that says, you know what, all you need to do is believe that God exists. Just believe. No, that's a different gospel. Because the gospel of Christianity says, I give my life over to the lordship of Jesus Christ. If you think you're a Christian but you haven't never made Jesus Lord, you're following a different gospel. You see, the gospel is this, that we confess with our mouth Jesus as Lord. He is the boss. He is the one who has control over our lives. So please, don't go around listening to people that preach a different Jesus, another Jesus. Don't pick up on another spirit or a spirit different than the spirit that God has given you as a born-again believer. And don't listen to people that are preaching another gospel, a gospel that has things added to it, not a pure gospel that Paul talked about in verse number 3, but things that are added to the gospel. Be very careful of what you're listening to. So the Apostle Paul is teaching, and he's talking about false teachers, false doctrine. And let me just say this as we close for today. We as believers need not to be so gullible that when people say little catchwords, that we just accept everything that they say. We need to be very careful, and we need to examine everything that we allow into our minds, because that's where it starts. Our minds accept it. Our minds take it in. That was the problem with the Corinthians. They were very mental. They thought things through, and you know what they thought? And they began to reason things out, and they began to receive another Jesus. They began to receive a different gospel, and they began to receive a different spirit. So please, please watch what you're listening to. Thank you for watching today. God bless you.